everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Pacific Historic Parks History Talk series brought to you in partnership with Edutainment Learning. Pacific Historic Parks is a nonprofit organization who works in partnership with the National Park Service, and together we support Pearl Harbor National Memorial in Hawaii, home of the USS Arizona Memorial, War in the Pacific National Historical Park in Guam, American Memorial Park in Saipan, Kalaupapa National Historical Park in Molokai, and Diamond Head State Monument in Hawaii. Our mission is to remember, honor, and understand World War II in the Pacific. Through education and interpretive programs, we strive to perpetuate the memory of historical events and honor the people that were involved. History Talks is an interactive series designed to share the history and the stories of Pearl Harbor and World War II in the Pacific. History Talks series was designed for students, educators, a general audience, and organizations from across the world to provide live interactions and continue education from our homes during these uncertain times. Today we have Dr. Carrie Brown, Supervisory Forensic Anthropologist and Laboratory Manager of DPAA. Dr. Brown will discuss the process DPAA is doing to recover and honor missing personnel of the Pacific War. Thank you, Dr. Brown, for sharing your knowledge with us on History Talk.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here. Full disclosure, this is my first time presenting on Zoom, and I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old in the background, so they may appear, although the blue screen may block them, so we'll see how it goes. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Good to go? Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Amanda. Well, welcome everyone. Like I said, I'm really excited to be here and giving this lecture today. I am a manager at our lab actually in Nebraska. So joining you from nowhere near the Pacific today in almost 70-degree weather from the great state of Nebraska. I am a UF, University of Florida alum. I got my PhD there in 2016, and I'm also a Chico State alum for my master's in 2009. So I've lived in a lot of the really sunny places all across America and ended up right in the middle. I've been with some form of what is now the DPAA since a training program in 2008 and then working full-time for them since 2009. And I actually was at the Hawaii lab for several years before transferring to the Nebraska lab. So what I'd like to do today, and keep the questions, if something comes up that I say and you have a question on it, go ahead and shoot that question in right away, and then we'll try and get to them at the end. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the DPAA. I work for the government and the Department of Defense, and we really love our acronyms. So we put an acronym inside our acronym. So the P in DPAA is actually an acronym for POW-MIA. I'll talk a little bit about what our agency does, and then I will talk about one of our specific projects that focuses on the identification of sailors and Marines from the USS Oklahoma. So bring it back to the Pacific parts in the Pacific arena. So what is DPAA? Some of you may be familiar with former entities of DPAA. So in January of 2015, we actually merged DPMO, which was largely in DC, the Joint POW-MIA Accounting Command, or JPAC, which was in Hawaii, largely in Hawaii, with detachments throughout the world to help us with our recoveries, and then the Life Support Equipment Laboratory in Ohio on Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So we joined all three of those to become one single accounting agency in 2015. We have primarily policy and historians and some operations folks in DC. We also have a larger contingent of operations in Hawaii, and then we have laboratories on Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, Offutt Air Force Base, which is where I am, and then Wright-Patterson Air Force Base still has some part of our life support laboratory. So that's just sort of the administrative part of where we came from. What do we do? Well, our mission is to provide the fullest possible accounting of our missing personnel to their families and the nation. And so largely we cover World War II, Vietnam, and Korea conflicts. with some Cold War. And then if you go to our website, you can see the specifics on each, and I'll go ahead and pull up a picture. I captured this as of last week, 19 May 2020. And there's the link for our website at the bottom, just to kind of show you who we're looking for and from where. And so you could see at the bottom, actually, there are some additional beyond the Cold War that are in our purview. But the biggest numbers for us really are still World War II. The largest number of unaccounted for is in the World War II theater, and that theater is all across the world. And so even some in North America, but then if you see Indo-Pacific there at the top right, World War II is still over 47,000 individuals unaccounted for. Okay, I'm gonna bring this up now, and then I'm gonna loop back around to it once we talk about all of it. How do we go from unaccounted for to identified? Well, we always use multiple lines of evidence. There's never enough to just simply say, here are dog tags for this person with this set of remains, and that's the identification. And so I really like this graphic and this diagram, because it's depicting how all of the lines of evidence are encompassed in that the blue dotted line, and you have multiple different lines of evidence overlapping in order to get you to the yellow star at the middle, which would be our identification. So we're trying to match a set of unknown remains, associated evidence, the historical background of that case, all together to fit one of the people in those tens of thousands on the previous slide. So I'm going to talk about each part of these individually, and then I'll loop back around to it at the end, and then we'll also talk a little bit about the Oklahoma and the unique situation of the Oklahoma. So how do we even get remains in the laboratory? In order right now to make a DoD identification of remains to, again, match something to a missing service member, we have to have we have to have the biological remains in the laboratory. And so there's generally two ways we can do that. We can go all over the world and conduct archaeological recovery. So that's the top photo. On the right-hand side, there's some teams out in the field. This is informed by both our own research as well as external partners' research that recommend places to go out in the world. And it's a multidisciplinary team led by an anthropologist or an archaeologist, also known as a scientific recovery expert. And so that team most often is majority active duty military, usually with a civilian anthropologist. If DPA is sending the team out into the field, and we'll have people like a linguist, explosive ordnance disposal technician, photographer, and other NCOs and other folks to help us out while we're in the field. And then that is led, again, by the anthropologist or the archaeologist. So that's one way, and we're not the only ones that do it. There are partners throughout the world, universities and NGOs and other groups that also conduct recoveries and help get those remains into the laboratory. We also have a program to disinter unknowns from around the world. And so right in Hawaii, right basically in the lab's backyard, is the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, or the Punch Bowl, where a large number of unknowns are buried, both from World War II and Korea. And then throughout the world, there are ABMC, or the American Battlefield Monuments Commission cemeteries, where we can also disinter remains. Now, what we do not do is go to the cemetery and disinter all the remains and bring them into the lab sort of willy-nilly. We have a really focused research program that combines historians, anthropologists, and dentists, or odontologists, to research the historical files. And so when someone was unable to be identified, for example, in World War II, that set of remains went through various different processing points to try and determine each time if we could identify that set of remains. And if we couldn't, they were then buried as what's called an unknown. And so all of the historical documentation, to include anthropology and dental, is also examined, and we make a recommendation for those, screaming child, we make a recommendation for those remains as belonging to a certain number of people on the short list. And so once that recommendation is approved, we then are able to go and disinter the remains. And I'm going into a little more detail about this because this is the way that the Oklahoma remains came into the laboratory and how we are now making identifications for those. So the first step really for us is historical documentation. We can look at military records, something known as the individual deceased personnel file that everyone has on file if they if the name says it all, individual deceased personnel file, or we can look at the entire official military personnel file. And so these are things that we look at both in our disinterment research, but also in our research to determine where to go out in the world and actually do an archaeological recovery. We can look at operational information, movements, flight plans, maps, etc. You're looking for an F4 in Vietnam. Where did it leave from? Where was it supposed to go to? And what's the flight plan? Where did it potentially get shot down? All that kind of information. Witness statements, survivor statements. Obviously, for the World War II cases, those are a little more challenging, but often if we go back to the IDPF, the individual deceased personnel file, we will have statements in there from folks that were collected at the time they were trying to figure out what had happened to the folks on the battlefield. So we start always with historical documentation, and this is actually a picture of one of our historians here at Offutt working with some maps. We also conduct investigations and witness interviews. So just some examples of this kind of activity. So we don't just show up in a country with our shovels and say, start digging. There's a lot of background that goes into it. So we'll talk to people that were primary, maybe, or secondary witnesses. We'll also do investigations when we clear brush and look for things like aircraft parts or other elements of material evidence or grave depressions, things like that, to try and get an idea of the site. And so it's important to know, of course, when you're going to a site, are you looking for a plane crash? Are you doing ground loss? What are you working on? Are you looking for a burial? And all those types of things go into the research and the planning process. Archaeology at DPA. So this is the next step. We've done our background research. We've decided that we think we know where something is, and we're going to go actually out and do the recovery. Archaeology is controlled destruction. So if you show up and you just sort of dig everything really quickly and dump it into bags and bring it back, you've lost a lot of that information and the context. It's very important later in a laboratory. And so when we talk about archaeology being a component of the identification, it's very important that when we're out there, we're maintaining the relationships of items that we recover, but also the sort of relationship of those items to the greater environment that they're in. And so if you can imagine a piece of graph paper, and we take that graph paper and we lay it down over the surface that we're working on, that's what we're doing when we do archaeology at DPA. Now sometimes the surface is nice and flat, maybe in a rice paddy, and sometimes the surface is underwater, the bottom right, and so we have underwater archaeologists, folks that specialize in actually doing archaeology and recovering evidence underwater. In that top left is a great picture of a nice flat recovery scene. And then on the top right, we're going to apply that graph paper, but this time it's on a very, very steep incline. Funnily enough, planes don't tend to crash, and most of the time into really nice flat spaces or places that are really hospitable environments. So a lot of our recoveries are very challenging in that aspect. And you think about in India, for example, when you have to hike up and stay at 10,000, 11,000, maybe even 14,000 feet to recover planes that crashed there in World War II. And so it's a large variety of scenarios, but the general principle is the same. We're laying down a grid, we're excavating box by box, and we're recovering and documenting all of the evidence that's within each area. As we're doing this and as we're excavating each individual square, we are screening all the materials. We can dry screen, we can wet screen with a water source, and we are cataloging and collecting all those materials and looking for evidence of whatever context we're working in. So if we're working for a burial and for remains, or a plane crash, we're looking for life support items or aircraft wreckage that would support the particular plane that we're looking for. And so everything is screened and cataloged, and we always maintain where the item came from within the site. Possible evidentiary items, just some examples of things we may find in the field. An important part to know about being in the field is that we are never going to make a call, like a final end-all call about something in the field. We're going to bag it and bring it back to be looked at in the lab, where we can clean it up, where we have microscopes, where we have great lighting. The field is not the spot to make that call. But everything that could be possibly evidentiary is packaged and brought back to our laboratories. So, like I just said, recovered evidence is accessioned into DPA laboratories. Bottom left is a view of the interior of the lab in Hawaii. And then the bottom right is the Offutt Air Force Base lab right outside of, we always say Omaha, but it's really in Bellevue. It's right outside of Omaha, Nebraska. Interestingly, the building that we are in Nebraska is actually the Martin Bomber building, which is the building where they built the Enola Gay to end World War II. And so I always think it's a really amazing historical twist that we are actually identifying the guys from the Oklahoma who died on the very first day of World War II inside of the building where they built the plane to end World War II. It's just really kind of cool how that's come full circle, and there we are inside that building working. So evidence from the field comes in, and we accession it. Our evidence coordinator brings it in and brings it into our evidence system. We are an accredited laboratory under what was known as ASCLD Lab. All of those words right there stand for ASCLD Lab, now known as ANAB. They just change names and acronyms like we do so often. So again, 2 core sites, and then we have the life support out at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base as well. We also have life support in Hawaii. We just have 2 separate sites for that. Okay, analysis in the laboratory. And so here's just some photographs. And I really like the one in the middle bottom, because it really looks like CSI, right? I'll go ahead and ruin any notions that we work in the dark. We don't work in the dark. We really like a lot of light while we're working on evidence, but the working in the dark with some focused light pictures always look cooler and come up better when we're doing photography for presentation. So the bottom middle is our CSI photograph. And that's an analyst working on material evidence in the laboratory. So material evidence is anything like a dog tag, a watch, things like that the person had on him. I say him, we mainly are identifying males from prior conflicts, although we did do a search recently to discover there are 19 women missing in action. So we can't say that everyone we're looking for is a male, but for the most part they are, because of the composition of the military in the past. So I'm just going to walk through now some of the different types of analyses that we do. We do anthropological analysis. So I myself, I'm an anthropologist. I went to school for anthropology. And what I do is I work with a set of remains, and I try to come up with a description of what's called the biological profile for that set of remains. And so these are things that will help describe the person in life that we could match up to a biological record, so a medical record or something like that. What this does, this doesn't give us an ID for sure, right? Especially because of the population we're dealing with. We're dealing with a lot of guys that are around 5'8", a lot of guys that are in their 20s. Most of the composition of our sample are of European ancestry, or what we would colloquially call white. So what it does do is it can narrow the list of possible individuals. So if you have 10 guys in a plane and you have 10 sets of remains, and you're trying to figure out who's who, maybe there's one guy in there that's really short and one guy that's really tall, and that'll help separate out as well. But remember, our diagram just one component of our puzzle, one piece of the puzzle. And so the things that we can talk about as anthropologists are sex of the remains, male or female, age of the remains. Never going to be something like this individual was 25, but will always be an interval, so 20 to 25, things like that. I will tell you that it's easier to provide an age estimate for a younger individual because they're based on processes of growth and development, and up until about your mid-20s, late 20s, you still have enough growth and development going on in your body to be able to have a good interval. But about age 25, maybe 30, in terms of skeletal issues, we all sort of start falling apart, unfortunately. And then it becomes a little bit harder to get that interval as narrow as we can when we're younger, just because we all have different life experiences and we all fall apart at different rates, right? So for our population, we're usually much younger, but as you get into the older ages, the intervals become wider and then less useful for narrowing the list of possible individuals. Ancestry is also something that we can do, usually using the facial skeleton, because that's the most different among people. And then stature is height. Generally take a long bone, preferably a leg bone, and measure it and plug it into an equation to get a stature. We can also look at things like trauma and pathology, and trauma being things that happen at or around the time of death, or things that perhaps have happened in life, such as breaking a bone and healing, that would then appear in a medical record. And sometimes there are unique individual traits we can look at as well. So we take all of this write-up that the anthropologist does with the set of remains, which, by the way, they're doing when they know nothing about the case, right? They're doing it in what we call the blind, and so they're just coming up with a description based on the methods and techniques that they're using, and they don't know anything about who the individual may or may not be. And then someone else will compare that with the antemortem or the pre-death data, and maybe that will help us segregate remains that are mixed together, or maybe it'll help us narrow the search space and come up, help with that list of possible individuals to then incorporate into our multiple lines of evidence. Something else that we can do, and this is something that anthropologists have done for a really, really long time, informally, but that the DPA laboratory actually refined into a method we can make identifications, is radiographic comparison. And so what you're seeing here are your neck bones and your clavicles, which are your collarbones, and they're being compared. At the top are remains, and the bottom are chest radiographs of folks in life. And this is a really interesting method that was developed because actually remains coming out of the punch bowl related to the Korean conflict, we were having problems getting DNA, and it turns out the preservative chemicals they used back in the 50s to sanitize or preserve the remains for shipment, for burial, actually bind with the DNA so that when you sequence the DNA, it basically shatters everything on a molecular level. And so we weren't having any luck there. And so we had an expert come in and help develop this program so we could take these chest x-rays, which are what everyone had to do in order to screen for tuberculosis, and then actually superimpose and compare those chest x-rays with folks that could potentially belong to the remains. So again, narrowing that search space, generating a short list, finding places where names overlap within our big circle. And here you see the postmortem. So the remains on the top, and then the bottom left, you have your points of concordance, so your similarities, and the bottom right, you have those clavicles overlaid again on that original antemortem chest radiograph. Something else we can do is dental analysis. We'll get to this a little bit more when we talk about the Oklahoma. I also see that there's a typo on this slide, and it says table 3 instead of the lowercase e, so that's nice. It's a little twist, keep you awake. A little twist on how we spell table. But what we're doing essentially is we're comparing dental records to what we have in the table. So we say postmortem, those are remains that we have, antemortem are the records that we're looking at. Of course, we're not comparing in most instances to everyone. We might have some idea of a short list, and we're making that comparison. We don't really have radiographs for anyone except Vietnam or more recent. So we have for Korea and World War II, and if we happen to get anything further back in history than that, we would use written records. And so it's a little bit tricky with written records because maybe someone didn't see something the same as you. You're not using radiographs, so you can't see your third molars. How many people still have their third molars? Well, without a radiograph, you can't see those. And so they may be marking them as absent, and when we get the remains and they're present, but the dentist can tell they aren't actually erupted. And that's what's happening here. If you see V impacted, that's a tooth with no restorations that never erupted. And so the kind of comparisons that we're making, and the dentist can come up with a determination of possible, probable, or positive dental ID in terms of what we have, and then comparing it to those medical records. We are very fortunate in the sense that we work with the military, and the military has excellent records. And so very often we can go and pull up these records for folks and have something to compare to, which is a little bit different than if you were working a cold case in a civilian population. You might not have access, or folks may have not gone to a dentist. At a minimum, we usually have an enlistment record for these folks. Okay, stable isotopes is new, and actually our laboratory is the very first to be accredited in stable isotopes in terms of using them for identification purposes. It's so new that I didn't even yet incorporate it into the Venn diagram. That's how new it is. For us at least. Stable isotopes have been used for a long time for various applications within anthropology and bioarchaeology and elsewhere. But in terms of identification, they're relatively new on the scene. And so we're looking at different ways, I'm going to bundle it all up. I'm an anthropologist. Leslie, if you're here, you can laugh along with me as I explain this. Stable isotopes are recording things like diet and your location, and so possibly where you were born or what you were eating. And so think about in America, we eat a lot of corn. In other countries, they eat a lot of rice, and those are things we can tease out with stable isotopes in the bone and the tooth structure when we analyze them. Now, these are useful for exclusion, but not direct identification. So just because you have a signature that looks like you grew up eating a lot of corn doesn't mean we can match that exclusively to you, but it may help, especially in cases like Vietnam, where we have very little left of the remains. The preservation is quite poor with the acidic soil, that you might be able to distinguish, for example, someone of Southeast Asian origin versus someone of US origin, and that's where that can be very, very helpful. It can also be helpful as a precursor to DNA analysis to say we think these remains might be American, or they're probably not American. Okay, DNA evidence. We're not doing the kind of DNA, I always like to bring it back to CSI, because the question I get a lot, like, can't you just take a sample, 45 minutes later, you're done, case closed. We are using mitochondrial DNA. And from mitochondrial DNA, we use a family reference sample. There's two different reasons for that. The first reason is, most of the time, we are dealing with cases that are so far removed, so now almost 80 years, for example, for the Oklahoma, that it would be impossible to find a self-reference for that individual. And it's not possible to go back and get a self-reference. And that self-reference is the stuff that you see on TV where it's like 99.9% matches whoever. That's nuclear DNA. And so we track down, instead of that relationship, we track down a familial relationship when we go through the maternal line to get that mitochondrial DNA to match it up. The other really great thing, besides the fact that our whole system is built on mitochondrial DNA, because that was the first technology that was really available for ancient remains, the other great thing about mitochondrial DNA is that each one of your cells has a single nucleus. There are hundreds of thousands of mitochondria in each cell, which means that you have hundreds of thousands of copies per cell to grab later when you only have one for your nucleus. And so when you're going back and trying to take samples from bone that's 70, 80 years old, you get a lot more success with mitochondrial. So that's the angle we have gone. It is not individualizing, but again, it's part of that overlapping Venn diagram, and we can use it to exclude individuals and then match to someone. So again, 10 individuals in a plane, you have family reference samples for all of them. Perhaps you're lucky and they all have a different mitochondrial DNA sequence. Because you've narrowed that down with your historical, with your archaeology, with all of your other lines of evidence, you can then use the mitochondrial DNA as part of that tool. We now do nuclear, so it is possible for us to test for nuclear, and again, we need the right references. So Y chromosome or Y STR would be someone from the paternal line, and then we can also do self, but you would need, it's more of a statistical, working statistically to figure it out. But all of our DNA is run through AFMES at Dover. The DNA is done at AFDIL there. More acronyms for you. This picture is just an example of how we're matching it up. So we're looking at similarities along the sequence. And so where you see it circled in red, for example, the first one there on the top left, TCC, and you're looking at then matching up on the CC, whereas so you're looking at similarities between the bone that you're testing and the reference that you have in comparison. Okay, so here is our Venn diagram again. We have our historical background, our archaeology, material evidence, forensic anthropology, DNA. Maybe we did some isotopes. Maybe we did some chest radiograph comparison in there. And we also have forensic odontology or dentistry. And we need to match up as many of these as possible in order to get to that yellow star identification. Okay, so that's kind of the overview of what we're doing, and what I'd like to do for the next 10 minutes, I think we have about 10 minutes until questions, is just talk a little bit more specifically about one of our special projects. Now, this screen with all of this text, which one of my professors at Chico State would have made me skip past because there were too many words when I was presenting it. You don't need to really focus on it except for me to tell you that we have initiated a lot of special projects in order to focus on specific battles or locations. And this is because you saw the numbers back on one of the first slides. It's quite simply impossible to just attack it at all 70,000 plus. And so what do? Well, we have to collect, remember, historical documentation. We might have to go out to a site. We definitely have to get DNA references, medical records, all these things that we have to get to make an identification. It's just not feasible to do it all at once for everyone. And so what we do for some of our identifications, we actually break it up into projects. And so we have various projects. You'll see a lot of them are World War II. Again, a lot of our missing are World War II. And one of those projects is the Oklahoma. And that's about 400 missing. So I'll just walk through that. I will tell you that I was the Oklahoma project lead for several years before I became a manager, and now there's another Carrie Lagarde is running the Oklahoma. So I will do my best to represent her and remembering all of the Oklahoma facts. Okay, the USS Oklahoma, 7 December 1941. Is hit and lists, trapping a lot of men inside. And so there are 429 casualties overall, but they go in and they try to rescue folks. And when they can't do that, they then begin to do recovery effort. And so for the first 8 days after December 7th, they're doing they're trying to save people, and then there's a break, and then they start salvage operations many months later. During all of this, they're trying to make identifications, and what ends up happening after all of these attempts is they have 394 unaccounted for, following the post-incident efforts at identification, and then the 1940s ID efforts. And what that means is when there were deaths in World War II, for example, but Korea, this was the same situation. Oftentimes, individuals would be buried as unknowns, then disinterred, and then attempts at identification were made only on dental, because dental and anthropology is what we have back then. We don't have DNA. And if the identification couldn't be made, they were reburied. So they were able to account for 35 individuals during these efforts and following the incident. What happens then is that they end up with a large number of remains that cannot be identified. And 392, what I'll refer to as bundles, bundled together, are buried in 62 caskets across 46 graves in the Punch Bowl, following these attempts in the 40s. In 2003, we disinterred the first grave, and I'll get to the excitement of that in just a minute. And then in 2015, we're given permission to disinter the rest of them. We also disinterred a separate Pearl Harbor unknown 2007 that ends up being in Oklahoma. He was just buried as a Pearl Harbor unknown. So our current status, we have all of the remains now at Offutt from Hawaii. When we laid everything out to inventory it, we realized that there were over 13,000 individual bones present. So that's a lot of different stuff to sort through. And even more so when we get to the next slide, you'll see why. And we've done about 5,000 DNA samples submitted. So those are those are samples total, but then we're testing all for mitochondrial and then some for other lines of evidence, depending on what we need. The new exciting part that I've updated in the slide for you all is that we actually just recently completed all of our mitochondrial DNA sequencing. That's a really, really big and exciting milestone for us. We also have about 85% FRS coverage, which means for 85% of the individuals unaccounted for from the Oklahoma, we have some type of DNA for them to compare to. However, there are some, it all sounds really good, right? We have really, really successful mitochondrial DNA sequencing. 99% of our DNA sequences for mitochondrial. We get really good nuclear rates considering how long it is. You can see here, look at all this data we have to compare it to. We know everyone's sex, we know almost everyone's ancestry and stature, we have everyone's age. Dental, we have about 80% coverage, and then look at all those family reference samples we have. But the remains are extensively commingled, and I will show you what I mean by that. So in 2003, we disinterred a casket that should have had 5 individuals in it. There was a lot of historical documentation suggested that maybe we could actually figure out who these 5 were, at least on dental. They just weren't proved back in the day. So we disinter the casket. From that one casket, now remember there's 62 caskets, right? From that one casket, we pull everything out. There are 5 bundles representing individuals, and we start to cut some DNA samples and look at them. From that first casket, we get 95 mitochondrial DNA sequences. 95, which means that at least 25% of the Oklahoma casualties are represented in casket 1. That's a really big, that becomes then a really big challenge. And I will tell you that it wasn't the only casket that was like that. We didn't disinter the rest of them and say, oh, shoot, well, that was the only one that was really mixed up. Everything else was fine. So 95%, 95 sequences means 25% of the casualties are represented by at least 1 bone in that very first casket of 61. Okay, so on the left of this is depicted in gray everything that's present. So if you just look at it anthropologically, what's present looks like 1 person, right? You don't have 2 heads. You don't have to go to school as long as I did to be able to say that, right? There's 1 person, easy enough. When we overlay the DNA data using mitochondrial DNA only, what we actually have is 12 different mitochondrial DNA sequences. So this is just one example of the commingling we're seeing. Again, this is 1 bundle. We have 392 bundles. We have 62 caskets. So we're going to flip to the other side of the coin. And again, we're going to look at it through the same lens. On the left is everything that's present in gray. And then on the right are now the colors represent the bundles that we pulled everything from. And so in this case, we have one mitochondrial DNA sequence for one person who is identified, but we have elements coming from 15 different bundles. And so the entire process of the Oklahoma is very much a very large jigsaw puzzle that we're sorting and putting back together. In this case, actually, you can see that the legs, so the lower legs in aqua color, they were right. So they matched those up correctly back in the day, but they weren't as lucky on the upper arm bones, the humeri at the top. Those are two different bundles. And when we look back at the data and we compare it with what we're seeing historically and then now with mitochondrial DNA, we find out that they were right. Matching, pair matching, we call pair matching left and right sides, they were right about 50% of the time, which for all of us that have ever gotten a 50% on something, we probably didn't feel very good when that happened, right? 50% is not a good grade. But when you think about the number of bones that we have and the types of comparisons that we're making, in fact, just to get one pair match, one left and one right together, you probably had to compare it 100,000 times. So when I think about that, the 50% doesn't seem so bad. But when we talk about getting upper to lower body, they were right only 7% of the time back in the day without the aid of DNA. And so it just gives us a little insight into that's probably due to chance, but there may actually be something behind the left and right pairs. But an Oklahoma individual is identified once we can match all of the parts of the diagram together, and everything exclusively ties to one person. So right now, of our unaccounted for, and I should say right now, it says in the last week, the 19th of May, we're at 251 identifications to the Oklahoma. It's really, really a tremendous process that everyone on the team has been through, and everyone that helped get the remains disinterred as well from the punch bowl to get to this point. One more interesting anecdote that doesn't really fit in because I kind of went right past it when I was talking about the dental, but I have like a quiz question for you. You could just, I'll just give you a minute to think. So the Oklahoma, when the guys were on the ship back in 1941, where were all of their dental and medical records kept? Just think to yourself for a minute. So we go back in 2003 and we start trying to collect all the dental and medical records. And we discover in doing that all of the records are kept on the ship. And so that becomes another really large challenge for the Oklahoma that is unique in this instance because we were able to, throughout the years up to 2015, get more records, but a lot of them are induction records. And so if you joined when you were 18 and the next year was 1941 and you were 19 on 7 December 1941, that record is probably pretty accurate. But if you're a career sailor and you were 45, and all of your dental records were on a ship, that becomes very, very hard then to make that comparison. So that's another tricky part besides the commingling, where you have many, many years that may have gone, and you have a set of remains, and do they reflect what you're seeing in the record or not? So just a fun trivia question for the Oklahoma. This slide is just a compilation that we've made of a number of the Oklahoma sailors and Marines that have been identified already to date. It's not all of them. It's not all 251. Just the first slide. And DPAA is fulfilling our nation's promise. And for more information, there's our website. We also have Facebook and YouTube, and we have an Instagram and a Twitter account.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for taking the time, and there was so much stuff that you educated all of us on, but this was definitely a crash course into an incredibly interesting career. Do you mind if we just jump straight into the questions?
Let's do it.
All right. So we have a question from Andy, and Andy, I will go ahead and unmute you, and you can ask your question. Go ahead and ask your question, sir.
Hi, Dr. Brown. Thank you for the information that you gave us today. It's very interesting. I'm very heartened by all of the hard work that you guys are doing to try to bring some closure to the families of all these men and women that have fallen for the country. My question is, as a family member of a Korean War MIA, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts regarding what the likelihood of our ever really being able to get any identifiable remains out of North Korea, and more specifically in the DMZ where he fell. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for your thoughts and for that question. I will be honest with you, I don't really know, as a lot of it really depends on external factors to us. We got the what we call the K-55. So back up a little historically, in 1993 to 1995, the North Koreans turned over boxes of remains to us, which we called the K-208, 208 boxes. And that was the beginning of our discovery and our forays into understanding commingled remains, because similar to the Oklahoma, you had the same types of instances where you had what looked like a person, but multiple DNA sequences. We have foreign nationals mixed in. And so that's been a project since to try and sort through since the 90s. And then, of course, we had the K-55 turnover more recently. But a lot of it is external to us, and I'm sorry, I don't have a really much better answer than that. We are getting identification still from the K-55 remains, and there are also foreign nationals mixed in with those remains as well. But I'm hopeful that we can continue to work towards perhaps another turnover, and maybe one day getting back in there for a recovery.
We have a question from Evan. See if he has any tech issues here. I don't think he can unmute his mic. Evan wants to know, were there any remains found of Japanese pilots?
Evan, in a specific area?
I think he means in your career, like, have you guys ever recovered any?
I'm sure that we have, but I do not know specifically. One of the complications that we face, and one of the reasons Isotopes is very interesting, is because we do have situations where foreign nationals are fighting alongside or against Americans in foreign countries. And so that's one of the tools we can use now. I have not personally done a recovery like that, but it certainly isn't out of the realm of possibility. And then we have individual agreements with each host nation on how we would handle that type of turnover of remains. But certainly we do it. Certainly we attempt in a lot of places to do what's called a forensic review before we leave the country, and that's where our experts come together with that country's experts, and we look at the remains and decide if we believe there's enough evidence that they are in fact American service members before we bring them back to the country. But we do have agreements with several of the nations we work in to return remains.
And I will just add that of the Japanese remains that were found in Pearl Harbor after the attack occurred, all of them were repatriated back to Japan during or immediately after the war.
Thanks, Amanda. That's great.
So we have a question from Patricia, and I'll go ahead and unmute her. Go ahead and ask your question, friend.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Oh, okay. The question I had was a sense from Dr. Brown of how many at the DPAA are scientists, how many are administrators, how many are clerks, you know, kind of a breakdown of how many people are working in this very important field.
So I don't actually know the numbers for the entire agency. I have a lot of facts in my head, but that's not one I can easily grasp. But for the laboratory, we have over 100 people within the laboratory itself. And we do have administrators, but here, for example, in a staff of 40, I have close to 20 anthropologists. And then the Hawaii lab has more people. So I think the lab is probably around 100, 120. And then the agency is over 600. And again, we have folks in DC and Nebraska and Hawaii, and then also detachments around the world to help with the deployments.
Thank you.
We have a couple
I'm an anthropologist, and I haven't done anthropology in a year because I'm a manager now. So I get to say I'm an anthropologist.
You're still an anthropologist.
Yes.
We have a couple more questions, and then we'll let you go. One of the questions here that I received is they want to know what is your background? Like, how did you get to your position?
Good question. I did cultural anthropology as an undergrad, but I wanted to be pre-med. But like everyone wanted to be pre-med, everyone always wants to be pre-med, and I've never wanted to do what anyone else has wanted to do. So I did cultural anthropology instead. I took a couple of years off, decided I wanted to go back to the medical angle, went to Chico State for my master's, and focused in biological anthropology with a focus on forensics. Chico State has a really, really outstanding program. And while I was there, I met the now lab director in Hawaii and said, hey, come on out and do some research. And I did that and graduated and then went back to work there. And I did a bunch of field deployments there and went to Florida to get my PhD and kind of came here. It was never something I thought I woke up, I'm going to do this, but it's something that keeps my interest. And I kind of was a happy accident that I ended up at this particular agency and this particular mission. But I've been doing this particular job for almost 12 years now.
And a follow-up question, someone wanted to know what advice could you give to somebody who wanted to get into school for forensic anthropology? Like, what are some of the things that they should study? And
yeah, there are actually not a lot, I will not say no, but there are not a lot of programs that are specifically focused on forensic anthropology. And my best advice is to get a school with a good four-field approach so you can get well-rounded in everything, because despite the fact that, my casework my former casework is in the forensic aspect and the remains aspect, I also, as part of my job, have done archaeology. And certainly cultural anthropology is very important because all the places we go to around the world are not America, right? And so there's a really, really important aspect of that. The second thing I would look for, to be honest, is what kind of skill can you pair with anthropology? Anthropology is amazing because it's just the study of what it means to be human, right? What kind of other thing can you bring? So right now, a lot of the hotter items are bioinformatics and statistics, data management, and ways that we can do things like sort 13,000 bones from the Oklahoma and do it faster than we making 100,000 comparisons. And so we have developed statistical and metric methods to help us with that. And so anything you can get as a chemistry or isotopes or anything along the side is also really helpful to set you apart in a program.
we have our final question from Deanna. Deanna, let's see if you can be unmuted.
Unmute it.
There you go, Deanna. Go ahead and ask your question.
Well, at the beginning of the world map, you had the MI missing remains in Vietnam. Can you give us that number again? And is that government cooperative with turning over remains of MIAs and POWs?
Yes, let's go back. I can't give it. I want to say 1700, but that may be wrong. So let's go 1587. So close. I rounded up a little too much. Yes, and actually, having been to Vietnam and Laos, I will tell you, I did a recovery in what would be considered back then in North Vietnam, and it was amazing. Understanding the history of the situation, and then at the end of our 45-day mission, I have U.S. military personnel and Vietnamese locals crying because they're going to miss each other because we're all leaving and going back to Hawaii. And so the DPA mission is oftentimes the first real touch point for a country in terms of humanitarian efforts in healing from any type of socio-political conflicts. And that, in fact, is what happened in Vietnam. And we have a really strong partnership with the Vietnamese government now. And that model of bringing together experts to look at remains to decide, that's actually out of Vietnam, the Joint Forensic Review. And so we've had really amazing partnerships in Vietnam and Laos as well, and Cambodia, in terms of the humanitarian effort, then bringing some type of aid to maybe a political resolution as well. And I think you would find that also for Russia. DPA is, I believe, one of the only sort of diplomatic and humanitarian things that's still happening in a good relationship between the United States and Russia.
We actually have one more student question. I hope you don't mind me. He's
No.
big into history. He's one of our students in Canada. Jaden, you are unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question, friend, and then we'll hand it off to Jen and Amanda.
Okay, perfect. So my question was, how does it feel when you can tell a family like that they can bury their loved one or their grandfather or their ancestor? And also, has any family come to you for help to identify them?
So I will tell you that amidst all of the red tape and the frustrations with some of the bureaucracy, working for the families is absolutely the reason that we all are doing this. And one of the most amazing parts of my job is to be able to welcome a family into the lab and actually talk to them like I've just talked to you about what we do, how we do it, and what it took us to get the identification of their specific case. And so when we're able to do that, I think it really brings things full circle. And as a scientist, you're often quite separated from the case and maybe don't see the full effects of your efforts. So here, last summer, we were able to identify the remains of identical twins that were on the Oklahoma, and they were actually buried in Lincoln, Nebraska, and so a lot of us were able to go. And it's that kind of, it's just, there is no other experience like it, really. And I don't care how many funerals I've been to for these kinds of things. They're just really indescribable almost. And can you remind me of your second question now that I've gotten excited and emotional about the first one?
I'm on mute. Oh, yeah, I was on mute. Has any family come to you for help?
To me personally, no. But we have an entire directorate, Outreach and Communications, which is also the directorate that works to arrange this type of talk that deals with those kinds of things. And something interesting for folks to know is that once we're back up and running in a non-lockdown situation, we actually have what's called a family member update in various places across the United States about every 6 weeks. And folks within a several 100-mile radius that have missing service members and their family are invited to come and have a brief like this, have a brief from the different directorates, and have sit-down one-on-ones on where their case is at and what we're doing. And so families are always more than welcome to reach out. I do have folks that reach out. I will generally direct them to OC because OC has a better handle on the entirety of the progress of the case. But then we also have, outside of DPAA, we have service casualty offices. So if your family member is a Marine missing in action, you can go to the Marine Corps Service Casualty Office and also talk to them about the details of the case. And if folks do need information about the service casualty offices, those are listed, the contact information is listed on the DPAA website, dpa.mil.
Thank you so much for taking the time to answer those questions, and we'll hand it off to our friends over at PHP. So, all right.
So I just wanted to end this call. Thank you again, Dr. Brown. That was fascinating. To remind people again why we do this. And these individuals that they're uncovering and returning home are family members, brothers, fathers, husbands, who their families never got that closure. And finally, they're able to do that. So we appreciate the DPAA and all the work, the painstaking work that they do. And we will continue to tell the stories of the individuals who never were able to return home. As you're seeing in this video, this is Water Tender First Class Edwin McCabe. these sailors and soldiers who attend the funerals don't know this person and maybe don't even know his story, but know that this is important to honor his life, to honor his service, and to provide a family for him who isn't able to be here. So we hope you enjoyed this presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Jen to close us out. Thank you.
To thank you all for joining us today. Again, Dr. Brown, it's been an honor to have you speak for us. We just would like to remind you that in our chat box, we do have a link that you can connect to with a short survey, and then that will allow you the opportunity to share your feedback, your suggestions, and any other questions that you may have for Dr. Brown that we can reach out to her later and get those back to you, the answers back to you.